Welcome to The Birth of Freedom, a Christmas story about mass incarceration and hope. Thank you for celebrating the birth of the Messiah with us in a meaningful way. Both ExodusFoundation.org and Freedom Project 180 are committed to ending the monster of mass incarceration, and they invite you to join them on this journey. I am your Mistress of Ceremonies, Patrice Funderburg. I'm a local community activist and founder of Educate to Engage. And I want to introduce you to our storytellers tonight. Ronald Zion Roseborough is a flourishing survivor of the prison industrial complex. He is CEO of Zion Poetic Press and visionary of Freedom Project 180. Please follow him at the address in your program. Zion is a published author of 9 books and an Amazon bestseller of 1. He has written editorial commentaries for national newspapers and magazines. He is the host of the War Room radio show, which is heard internationally.
Good evening. It is with great honor to be with you all today, to share with you the reality of why we're here, and as it has already been expounded upon, that the birth of freedom around the Christmas holidays. And I think that there is a consensus that that Jesus was born not only for restoration, but also for liberation. And you may be asking yourself, well, what in the world does Christ have to do with returning citizens that are commonly referred to as felons and ex-cons and ex-prisoners, those words that come with such a negative connotation and such a horrible essence to it, but he has a lot to do with it. And I just want to take a couple of seconds to just expound upon what Dr. Madeline mentioned as it relates to Christ and he being concerned with returning citizens that he referred to as the least of these. Christ himself was not convicted of a misdemeanor, not a felony, but a capital offense which was punishable by death. And he spent the remaining of his days not just in prison, but on death row. An execution that was carried out, which was backed by the government of Rome, by way of an indictment. Today, Jesus would have been executed by way of lethal injection rather than the most common method during his era of crucifixion. Now you may be saying, well, Brother Zion, wait a minute. Now Jesus did no wrong and he was an innocent man, and I agree with you 1,000%. He was an innocent man. But I submit to you today that there are many men and women by which are innocent, yet were convicted wrongfully in the court of law. I can testify to that myself. And these individuals are nameless, they're voiceless, and we have heard of many, such as the tragic suicide of Khalif Browder, how he was falsely accused and he was wrongfully convicted. And we hear about Brian Banks and so many others. However, this is a stark reality. In conjunction with that, Jesus was crucified between 2 thieves that did make a mistake. They did break the law for whatever reason. One that would receive him as Lord, and the other that did not. And interestingly enough, Christ being in the middle of these 2 returning citizens, but they're not really returning back to society because they now are being executed. These 2 prisoners, one received Christ and said, listen, I deserve this sentence, but this man actually, he did no wrong and he doesn't deserve this. Can you just have mercy upon me? Immediately, Christ responded by saying that not only do I forgive you, but I will expunge your record and then reward you by giving you a position. And that's a perfect segue because the population of Thailand is 69 million. The population of France is 67 million. The population of South Africa is 56 million, yet we have in the United States of America 70 million people with criminal records that outpopulate the nations and the countries that you just heard. This is a travesty. But between 688,000 and 700,000 men, women, and youth are annually released from prison. 9 million are released every single year. The unemployment rate of returning citizens are between 25 and 40%. These are staggering statistics, which brings us to my particular lane, and I have learned to occupy my own lane and to master that craft, whatever it may be. And I am not a criminal justice reformer. I am an abolitionist. I am an abolitionist as it relates to decriminalizing returning citizens. Those who receive unnecessary, unwarranted, illegal, and ungodly punishment as a penalty that is added on to a sentence that already has an expiration date. I submit to you, in the court of law, unfortunately, in these United States of America, there are two sentences that are mitigated in that particular court setting. There is one sentence that has an expiration date, and there is another sentence that has an eternal date, a date that you cannot max out by way of employment discrimination, by way of economic disenfranchisement. And the recidivism rate, as it is, stats really point to the fact that because of employment discrimination, that if returning citizens are not employed 8 months after their return or release, they have a 33% chance of going back to prison. After 1 year of unemployment, we see there's an increase in recidivism to 50%. And after 3 years, statistics show us factually that after 3 years of unemployment, there is a skyrocketing 70% of returning citizens that return right back due to employment discrimination. What's really diabolical about this is that the same companies, the Fortune 500 companies that employ returning citizens, some of them that were quote unquote prisoners, the ones that were fortunate enough to work a bare minimum of $1 a day, $2 a day, for these Fortune 500 companies that I will not name right now, that the same companies that had no problem with them working for their companies, providing goods and services for their companies while in prison, yet upon their release, they would not hire them. The same companies that saw value in them behind the fence or behind the wall now will totally turn their backs on the very ones that contributed to their fiscal earnings and will not even employ them. So that brings us to understanding employment discrimination as it relates to not getting a job, yet you have already met the requirements of the court system as it relates to your expiration date of the sentence, yet there is a secret societal sentence that is attached to the sentence that you max out, and it is called a penalty for committing the crime that you paid for or did not pay for or did not commit. There is a societal cost to this insanity, if you will. that the average cost or the average state cost of recidivism per prisoner is $118,746 per returning citizen. I'm going to allow that to sink in. Do you mean to tell me, rather than to hire men and women who are highly functional, who are highly skilled, by working the jobs in prison for Fortune 500 companies in prison that are ready and eager to work to be the provider of their families, to make a significant and positive impact in the communities, and to also funnel resources back into their municipalities, that we would rather pay $118,746 per person, which is not only an unnecessary burden upon tax-paying citizens, but now that returning citizen cannot even contribute from a local tax standpoint, a state tax standpoint, a federal tax standpoint. Let's talk about economic inequality that is attached to, obviously, employment discrimination. Did you realize that those with criminal records, or as I like to refer to it as social barriers, that they make between 10 and 40% less than their counterparts that don't have criminal records? Which means that if you have a job position that has a start out pay of $18 an hour, that returning citizen, because of he or her record, which they've already met the court's requirements of meeting, they will make, instead of $18 an hour, $15 an hour, $10 an hour, perhaps $8.50. This is, again, an unseen penalty that is waged upon returning citizens in an unwarranted sense and in a criminal-like instance, if you will, for one to have already paid their debt, yet it's still not good enough because now we're going to marginalize you economically. How can one make it without money in this world? How can you pay the cost of court, restitutions, back pay of child support that you were incarcerated in that you could not meet? Now you are ejected from this system to fend for yourself, and everywhere you go you hear a no. Though you're qualified, but they disqualify you because of your past, not your present. When we talk about economic inequality, I can vividly remember there was a job that I worked for this local printing company, and I had no prior experience in being a salesman. And I didn't start out as a salesman. I started out in the printing shop, and I was promoted in upward mobility position as it relates to not just a salesman, but the lead salesman of this printing company. So therefore, my job was to go out and to canvass the community, to solidify accounts for the company. And not only did I do it with grace, and I did it in a mind-blowing sense of having no prior experience, and I had not been cross-trained or trained for this. I was thrown into it, and just by sheer instinct, personality, and perseverance, not only did I excel, but I had unprecedented numbers. And I solidified 10 accounts, one in which was a $500,000 account. Rather than the owner acknowledging the job that I completed, and the monies that I was definitely bringing in, and instead of us talking about a raise that I think I deserve one, not just for the accounts that I solidified, but just by having the inexperience and now having mastered what you have thrusted me into, and the loyalty that I have exhibited to such a company. And in sitting down and speaking with him, he took offense to me wanting a raise. Why? Because he already knew about my past, and he kind of figured, I guess, that, hey, listen, you don't have a large pool of jobs, and so therefore you should be grateful. And not only did he take offense to the conversation, but that $500,000 account that I solidified for this company, the kickbacks that I would have received by way of the compensation from the sale would have been $50,000. That is in addition to my hourly wage. So it would be more advantageous for him to just force me out, to literally terminate me, than to have to reach in his pocket and pay me $50,000. This is a clear example of what I mean. So when we talk about economic inequality, this is real for returning citizens. Now, this is very interesting when we're talking about how many are marginalized economically. They're living a Jim Crow life. And I submit to you that slavery never ended. It just morphed into mass incarceration with the criminalization and unwarranted, unlawful punishment in the form of secret penalties on the lives of those who were formerly incarcerated by marginalizing them politically, socially, civically, and also economically. Did you understand? You won't believe this, but I was doing some research and I found that the growing cost of living, understanding that it varies from city to city or state to state, but for an example, here in Charlotte, North Carolina, it is said to live comfortably, it is estimated that you need a bare minimum medium household income of at least $53,274. Just the median income to just live comfortably. Now, there are not many returning citizens. There are not many citizens at all that are making $53,000, but certainly not returning citizens when we're talking about just to live comfortably. And so that brings us to the reality of feeling boxed in, feeling like you are an animal in a cage, feeling that you are right back in prison, and you are, many are, economically. Because if I can hold you, if I can arrest you and seize you economically and keep you in a certain tax bracket, I never have to worry about you advancing. You would just wither away. And so that brings us to restrictions and bans on occupational licensing. Restrictions and bans on occupational licensing means this, that there are many states that have passed a law that will ban returning citizens from receiving a license from a state board to either operate or practice within that state legally. What that means is that if you have aspirations of being a doctor, a lawyer, dentist, dental assistant, engineer, general contractor, plumber, we can go on and on, physical therapist, funeral director, you have to be licensed in the state that you wish to practice in or operate in legally. And that comes by way of a state board that will either approve or disapprove your license. So if you have embedded in the fiber of your laws that if you are a convicted felon, that you cannot be licensed to become a doctor, then how can you own your practice? If you can't receive the license to become a plumber, then how can you own your own plumbing company? You can't. And so now we're seeing that there is a strategic, this is not by happenstance. This is by design. And when we begin to understand that this is by design, the only way that this will end, and I have to say this, Dr. Mallon, there's an old saying that if you are in pain, complain. Why are you not complaining? If you have a backache, then say you do. If you have a toothache, then say you do, but do something about it. Until the 70 million rise up and say enough is enough, then it will continue to go on. unless the pain is so great that we refuse to bear it any longer. But many don't rise up because of the shame and the fear. See, most returning citizens, they just want to crawl in a hole and die.
Come on.
Most returning citizens, it doesn't matter how eloquent you dress or how eloquent you speak. I had the honor to receive my bachelor's degree from the prestigious Lee University with a minor in pastoral counseling and working on my master's. But unfortunately, with this secret, covert sentencing, it prohibits many from occupying and moving into a place of freedom whereby God has already given them, until we say enough is enough. And so when we talk about the bans and restrictions on occupational licensing, this is taking it up another level economically. So now, to further make you a second-class citizen, not only will I not hire you to work a 9-to-5 job at Walmart or any other type of store, and I'm just throwing out stores, you know, just kind of randomly, wherever, because of your record. Now we want to further marginalize you from even entrepreneurship through bans and restrictions on occupational licensing, which brings us to housing discrimination. If you live in public housing, you have to sign an agreement or an affidavit that no one with a felony can come live with you or even visit you. So if in fact you are fresh out of prison and you want to unite with your son to save him from the elements that almost snuffed you out, you're not even permitted on the property, let alone to spend time with your son, unless it's at an undisclosed location, off of the premise location. So now that is a sheer way of dividing the family. When we begin to understand, brothers and sisters, whether you're white, black, plaid, pink, I could care less about that foolishness. This is a moral and righteous issue. You can be as white as snow or black as coal. I could care less. Where is your moral strength? Where is your moral fiber on today to recognize that slavery never ended? It morphed into mass incarceration, but particularly the criminalization and the unwarranted and ungodly and unlawful punishment of those who have already paid their debt to society. And so that brings us to voting disenfranchisement. Do you realize that back in 1976, there was 1.17 million people that were unable to vote? Now in 2017, on the cusp of 2018, there are 6.1 million people that are barred from voting permanently. Do you realize that that is an entire nation of people? Do you realize that how they can change the entire climate from a political standpoint by casting ballots, by getting behind legislators, by appearing before legislators? It's almost like, I'll just say this as a sidebar, it's almost like when the NFL did not want to hear from Colin Kaepernick when they had the meetings. But Colin Kaepernick was the face of a particular movement that you say that you want to back, but you will not invite the one who was the face of that movement to you. Well, the very faces of the movement, by way of those who are being criminalized and unlawfully punished, once their sentencing is over, legislators, we need to speak with you. We need to have a roundtable discussion that you can hear that these secret sentencings are unlawful because it was never brought out in the courtroom. When the judge said that you have 64 months, he never said that you will be discriminated against. from an employment standpoint. He never said that you would have to worry about voting disenfranchisement. He never said along with the sentencing comes housing discrimination. Along with the sentencing, you will lose any type of county benefits, or you can't obtain county benefits or a disability because of your past. That was never spoken about in the sense of the sentencing guidelines. So no one was prepared for that until the exit of prison. So that brings us to a lot of the emotions, a lot of the grief, a lot of the trauma. Because when you are incarcerated, you are thrusted into an uncivilized culture. An uncivilized culture that one must adjust to, and you carry that out or over into modern day society by way of shame. Because we have to understand that PTSD is not only relegated to our veterans that put their lives on the line, but in this audience right now, I'm willing to bet that you have come face to face with some sort of trauma in your life. And trauma is rooted in grief. Grief is indicative of a loss that you obtain, a loss. I lost my job. I lost my mother. I lost my grandmother while incarcerated. I wanted to go to the funeral, but my family couldn't afford me to be transported to the funeral at a $500 pay. So I lost so much. And so this grief becomes internalized, and it becomes not only shame and self-loathing, but you begin to reject yourself as society continues to reject you, because the narrative is that yes, you have paid your debt, but we still don't trust you. We cannot hire you. Yes, you have met your expiration date, but we still have another sentence here that's called public scrutiny. So that brings us to hopelessness and fear and anger. Anger that seeps into other areas of your life. Anger that begins to just eat away at you as a deadly disease if it is not identified and eradicated, which brings us to suicide. And did you realize that returning citizens are 8 times more likely to commit suicide than the national average? And that with over 25% of those suicides, they occur within the first 4 weeks of their return. I'm going to conclude this by throwing out a name. When we talk about voting disenfranchisement, we talk about housing discrimination, we talk about economic inequality due to employment discrimination. We talked about all of those sentences that do not expire, that were attached to a sentence that did expire. Aldous Huxley, if you get a chance to look him up, Aldous Huxley was a British writer, very eloquent British writer. He said something that was very profound that I would like to share with you tonight. He said that the propagandist's purpose is to make one set of people forget that certain sets of other people are human. He said that the propagandist's purpose in life is to make one set of people forget that other certain sets of people are even human. Isn't that what Hitler did to our brothers and sisters who were Jews? That by way of the Third Reich ministry of public enlightenment and propaganda, that they seized the music, the art, the theaters, the films, the books, the radio, educational material, and the press to create mass hysteria and media sensationalism in saying that the Jews are less than human. The Jews are criminal. The Jews are evil. The Jews you cannot trust. The Jews must be exterminated. And he led a 3.5-year campaign before the death camps, before the incinerators, before the death graves in manifold measure. And by the time that the Germans continued to hear in heavy rotation how evil the Jews were that were in prison, they were ready for them to be killed. And I submit to you that that same propaganda is in the form now of the narrative that's being fed to general society concerning those who we regard as returning citizens.